Stop. Listen. Pay attention. Chosen one. This is not another message passing through your day. It is a direct interruption placed here with intention. There is urgency but not panic. No alarm bells, just precision. You have been carrying a quiet pressure that does not announce itself loudly. Yet it has been present in your body, your thoughts, your timing. Fatigue that sleep did not fully resolve. A sense of being alone even when surrounded. Moments where clarity flickered and then pulled back, leaving you steady but unanswered. You kept moving anyway. That matters. You may have questioned why things took longer than expected, why progress felt delayed without being blocked, why effort did not escalate into collapse, yet relief did not arrive either. This tension was not dramatic. It was persistent, subtle, the kind that tests endurance rather than strength. And still, you remained functional. This message is not here to heighten the tension. It is here to explain it, not all at once, not with spectacle, with grounded clarity. What you experienced had structure. It followed a sequence. It was not random, and it was not personal in the way you may have assumed. You were not being punished. You were not failing. You were not missing a step. You were outlasting something. There is a difference between overcoming and enduring. Overcoming requires force. Enduring requires alignment. You were not asked to fight. You were asked to remain, to keep your inner order intact while time moved forward. To let something exhaust itself without feeding it, reaction, fear, or urgency. That kind of waiting is not passive. It is active restraint. You may have felt moments of irritation without anger, doubt without panic, weariness without despair. These are not contradictions. They are signals of a system that stays coherent under extended pressure. You did not escalate. You did not self-destruct. You did not abandon yourself to prove anything. This is where clarity begins. What is being revealed here is not mystical or exaggerated. It is practical and personal. Something attempted to outlast you. It did not succeed. Not because you pushed back, but because you stayed consistent when instability expected reaction. This message is intentional. It is calibrated to your experience, not a generalized idea. You are hearing it now because the pressure has already shifted, and understanding is the final piece. Stay present. The explanation unfolds from here. This is where uncertainty is removed. This message is not meant to resonate with everyone who hears it. It is meant to register with you. If you are still listening, it is because something in you already knows this applies directly. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, personally. What unfolded did not happen around you. It happened against you, not in an aggressive way, but in a measured one. There was an expectation placed on your internal limits. An assumption that time itself would weaken your focus, drain your resolve, or fracture your sense of direction. That expectation failed. You are being addressed as the chosen one here, not as a title, but as a description of function. It describes someone whose internal structure does not collapse when stretched. Someone whose stability is not dependent on external reinforcement. Someone who remains intact even when outcomes are delayed and explanations are withheld. This is not about conscious effort. You did not wake up every day preparing to endure something. You did not brace yourself or adopt a survival mindset. You simply continued to be who you are. That is the point. Many people struggle loudly because their stability requires constant attention. They need reassurance, validation, or visible progress to stay regulated. When those are removed, they unravel. You did not. You adjusted without drama. You absorbed uncertainty without amplifying it. You stayed oriented even when clarity was partial. That is automatic strength. It operates below thought, below strategy. It does not announce itself because it does not need to. You were not resisting pressure in a visible way. You were neutralizing it by remaining internally ordered. That is why there was no obvious battle, no crisis moment, no breaking point. What makes this significant is that the situation relied on your reaction. It depended on frustration, escalating into impatience, on waiting, turning into self-doubt, on silence, becoming noise inside you. None of that happened. You noticed the weight, but you did not personalize it. You felt the delay, but you did not interpret it as a failure. You experienced isolation, but you did not abandon yourself to it. This is not common behavior. It is not taught. It is inherent. This is the identity being clarified now. You are someone who does not need to win visibly to succeed. You outlast conditions by remaining coherent while they exhaust themselves. You do not force outcomes. You let misaligned pressure dissolve through time and non-engagement. This message is for you because you lived it. And now that the identity has been named, the experience itself can be understood without distortion. There is one symptom you recognized immediately, even if you did not name it at the time. It was not fear. It was not despair. It was a dull, persistent sense of mental fatigue that did not match your actual effort. A tiredness that did not come from doing too much, but from holding something steady for longer than expected. You may have judged yourself for it. You may have wondered why focus felt heavier, why motivation came in waves instead of surges, why rest did not always feel restorative. That self-judgment is understandable, but it is misplaced. What you experienced was not a flaw in your discipline or clarity. It was a signal. This kind of fatigue appears when a system is under sustained pressure without escalation. There is no adrenaline spike, no emergency response, just quiet endurance. Your mind and body were maintaining internal order while something external attempted to wear you down through duration rather than intensity. That is why it felt confusing. If something had gone wrong, you would have had language for it. Anxiety, burnout, conflict. But this was different. You were still functioning, still thinking clearly, still making reasonable decisions. Yet there was a background weight as if time itself had slowed slightly around you. That weight was not evidence of weakness. It was evidence of containment. You were holding a boundary without tightening it. You were staying present without forcing resolution. That requires energy, even when it looks like nothing is happening, especially when nothing dramatic is happening. Many people associate fatigue with failure. You did not fail. You maintained coherence. The tiredness you felt was the cost of not fragmenting, of not escaping into distraction, emotional reaction, or impulsive change just to feel movement. Your system chose stability over relief. That choice was not conscious. It was automatic. And that is why you did not feel heroic or empowered during it. You felt neutral, slightly worn, occasionally impatient, still grounded. This reframes everything. What you interpreted as stagnation was actually regulation under load. What felt like delay was a period where pressure was being absorbed without being returned. You were not meant to fix the sensation. You were meant to allow it to pass without mislabeling it. Once you stop treating that fatigue as a personal problem, its meaning becomes clear. It marked a transition, not into chaos, but through compression, like a structure tested for integrity, not speed. This prepares you for the next layer of understanding, because now that the symptom has been reframed, the source of the pressure can be examined without distortion or exaggeration. You were not slowing down because you were weak. You were holding steady while something else ran out of momentum. Now the pressure itself can be described plainly. What you encountered was not visible, dramatic, or chaotic. It did not announce itself with conflict or confrontation. It arrived as a coordinated strain applied over time. Subtle, intentional, structured to test duration rather than provoke reaction. This matters because pressure of this kind is designed to look ordinary. It blends into routine. It hides inside delays, unanswered questions, and prolonged uncertainty. Nothing obviously breaks. Nothing openly attacks. The assumption is that you will do the work of destabilization yourself. The timing was not random. It concentrated within a recent window where several things overlapped. Progress slowed, feedback thinned, momentum plateaued. The environment around you grew quieter without explanation. This was not an accident of circumstance. It was a narrowing of variables meant to isolate your internal response. And still, you stayed functional. You continued to show up. You maintained perspective. You did not collapse into speculation or invent narratives to fill the silence. You noticed the pressure, but you did not dramatize it. That is the detail that changes the outcome. Invisible pressure relies on amplification. It depends on internal noise, on overthinking, emotional escalation, or reactive decision-making. When those do not occur, the pressure has nowhere to go. It cannot convert into damage. You were expected to compensate, to push harder, to overextend, to chase clarity prematurely, to exhaust yourself trying to force an outcome. You did not. You adjusted your pace without abandoning your direction. This is not passive behavior. It is controlled restraint. You may not have recognized it as such in the moment. It likely felt unremarkable, even dull. But restraint under sustained uncertainty requires an internal structure that does not panic when timelines stretch. Many people interpret that stretch as rejection or failure. You did not. You remained present. You remained rational. You remained available to your life without narrowing into fixation. That is why the pressure did not escalate. It could not. This kind of confrontation ends quietly, not with a reversal or visible win, but with a loss of traction. The strain dissolves because it is no longer being engaged. Time exposes its limits. You outlasted it without needing to name it. This is the reveal. The pressure was real. It was recent. It was intentional. And it failed because you did not supply the reaction it required. You stayed coherent long enough for it to exhaust itself. That sets the stage for understanding how specific pressure points were targeted and how you moved through each without losing internal balance. To understand what actually occurred, it helps to slow the experience down and separate it into distinct pressure points. Not to dramatize them, but to clarify how they operated and why they failed. Each one was subtle on its own. Together they formed a sustained attempt to destabilize you through accumulation rather than intensity. The first pressure point was doubt, but not the obvious kind. This was not self-loathing or panic. It was the quiet suggestion that your steadiness meant stagnation. That if nothing dramatic was happening, nothing meaningful was happening at all. The pressure tried to turn patience into a question mark. You felt it as a slight mental drag, a repeated impulse to reassess decisions that had already proven sound. And yet you did not spiral into second-guessing. You reviewed when necessary, then returned to center. Doubt passed through without being hosted. The second pressure point was emotional flatness. Not sadness, not numbness, just a muted range where highs did not spike and lows did not crash. This state often triggers people to seek stimulation or conflict just to feel something move. You did not. You allowed neutrality to exist without interpreting it as loss of passion or purpose. That choice preserved your energy. Emotional regulation remained intact even when emotional reward was delayed. The third pressure point was energy drain. This one is easy to misread. Your output did not collapse, but your margin narrowed. Tasks took slightly more effort. Recovery took slightly longer. This is where many people push beyond reason, trying to overpower the sensation. You adjusted instead. You conserved where needed. You did not abandon responsibility, but you respected your limits without dramatizing them. That prevented depletion from becoming damage. The fourth pressure point was isolation. Not physical separation, but a thinning of resonance. Conversations felt less aligned. Feedback was sparse. Shared understanding seemed delayed. This can create a false sense of being unseen or unsupported. You felt the quiet, but you did not turn it inward as self-rejection. You stayed connected to your own orientation even when external mirrors were temporarily unavailable. The fifth pressure point was delay. This is often the most corrosive because it distorts perception of progress. Timelines stretched without explanation. Outcomes paused without clarity. Many people interpret this as a sign to force movement or abandon direction. You did neither. You allowed delay to exist without converting it into urgency or defeat. You remained patient without becoming passive present, without becoming restless. Across all of these points, the common factor was regulation. You did not escalate internally when pressure increased externally. You did not collapse when reinforcement was removed. You did not confuse discomfort with danger. Each pressure point relied on you supplying extra reaction to become effective. You did not. This is the detail that matters most. There was no moment where you won, no dramatic release, no emotional high. The stability you maintained was quiet, almost unnoticeable. But it was continuous. And continuity is what outlasts systems designed to exhaust. What you experienced was not a battle. It was a test of coherence across multiple domains at once. Thought, emotion, energy, connection, and time. You stayed balanced across all of them, not perfectly, but sufficiently. That is why the assignment ended. Not because it was confronted, but because it ran out of leverage. Now the experience can be reviewed without distortion. Not emotionally, analytically. When you step back and examine what actually occurred, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The outcome was not the result of luck, timing, or coincidence. Too many variables aligned too cleanly. Too many pressure points failed in the same way. What held was not circumstance. It was you. Look at the sequence. Pressure increased, but your internal coherence did not fracture. Reinforcement decreased, but your orientation remained intact. Time stretched, but your sense of self did not erode. These are not passive outcomes. They indicate a stable internal framework that does not depend on constant feedback to remain operational. This is where clarity replaces interpretation. If the situation had been random, your responses would have varied wildly. If it had been about external conditions alone, your stability would have risen and fallen with them. Instead, you remained largely consistent across changing inputs. That consistency is the confirmation. There is a tendency to minimize this kind of resilience because it does not look dramatic. There was no visible triumph, no clear before and after moment. But that is precisely why it is credible. What endured did so quietly, without performance or self-congratulation. When people collapse under pressure, they often do so in predictable ways. They rush decisions. They seek reassurance compulsively. They lose focus or inflate urgency. You did not follow those patterns. Your responses were measured. Your pacing adjusted without derailing. Your attention remained distributed rather than fixated. This rules out chance. What remained stable across the duration was your internal alignment, your ability to hold uncertainty without converting it into anxiety, your ability to experience delay without narrating it as failure, your ability to feel strain without letting it define you. That is internal resilience. Not the kind built in crisis, but the kind that exists before crisis and therefore prevents it from forming. This review is not meant to elevate you. It is meant to ground you, to remove doubt about what actually happened so you do not mislabel endurance as stagnation or restraint as hesitation. You were not waiting because you lacked direction. You were waiting because there was nothing to fix. Once this is understood, the experience settles into place. Not as something unfinished, but as something completed quietly. The pressure resolved not through intervention, but through non-engagement. The assignment ended because it could no longer extract reaction energy or confusion from you. This confirmation is important because it recalibrates how you interpret future stretches of stillness or delay. You now have evidence, not belief, evidence of how your system responds under sustained load. And with that evidence, the next layer of understanding can be approached without exaggeration or doubt. It is important to place your experience beside what is more common, not to elevate it, but to clarify it. Most people do not respond to prolonged pressure the way you did. They do not remain present when reinforcement fades. They do not stay regulated when timelines stretch. Even minor uncertainty is enough to fragment attention, distort self-perception, or provoke reactive behavior. This is not a criticism. It is a pattern. When pressure persists without explanation, many people begin to personalize it. They assume something is wrong with them. They rush to fix what is not broken. They overcorrect, abandon direction, or seek external signals to replace internal stability. Functionality declines long before anything actually collapses. You did not follow that trajectory. Under comparable conditions, many people experience sharp emotional swings. Motivation spikes and crashes. Focus narrows into obsession or dissolves into avoidance. Relationships strain as internal noise seeks an outlet. You experienced strain, but you did not export it. You remained available to your life without demanding it resolve your discomfort. That is uncommon. Not because you are stronger in a dramatic sense, but because your system does not require constant confirmation to remain intact. You did not need the situation to make sense in order to stay steady. You tolerated ambiguity without filling it with fear or false certainty. Most people cannot do that for long. They either disengage completely or escalate internally until something breaks. You did neither. You stayed functional, oriented, and responsive without becoming reactive. That combination is rare not because it is impressive, but because it requires a level of inner coherence that is not widely developed. This rarity is not a badge. It is a responsibility to understand yourself accurately. If you misinterpret this steadiness as nothing special, you may undervalue how you operate. If you exaggerate it, you risk turning it into an identity performance. Neither is accurate. What matters is recognizing that your baseline response to pressure is not typical. You did not endure because you were trying to prove resilience. You endured because coherence is your default state. Pressure did not transform you. It revealed what was already in place. This comparison is not meant to separate you from others. It is meant to orient you correctly, to help you see that remaining present and functional under sustained uncertainty is not something everyone can do, even though it looks quiet from the outside. And because it is quiet, it is often misunderstood. Understanding this prepares you to clarify your identity without inflating it, grounding what you are in how you consistently function, rather than how you appear under stress. What needs to be clarified now is subtle but essential. Your strength did not switch on during this period. It did not activate in response to pressure. It was already present, operating quietly before anything began. What you demonstrated was not a peak state or a heightened mode. It was baseline. This matters because many people misunderstand resilience as something they summon in crisis. They imagined strength as an emergency response. What you exhibited was different. Your internal structure was already arranged in a way that did not require escalation. You did not become someone else to endure. You remained yourself. This points to preparation, not performance. At some point before this stretch, your system learned how to stay coherent without forcing certainty, how to hold direction without rigid timelines, how to remain internally aligned even when external variables shift. That learning did not happen recently. It was integrated over time through lived experience, reflection, and adjustment. That is maturity. Maturity is not loud. It does not rush to declare itself. It shows up as proportional response, as the ability to feel pressure without magnifying it, as the capacity to remain flexible without becoming unstable. You did not suppress discomfort. You allowed it without letting it steer you. This is the identity being locked in now, not a role you play, but a structure you live from. You are someone whose inner coherence reduces chaos rather than reacting to it, someone whose patience is not passive waiting, but informed restraint. Someone who does not need to dominate situations to remain intact within them. This clarification removes confusion about why the experience unfolded the way it did. Nothing needed to be conquered because nothing overtook you. Nothing needed to be forced because nothing blocked you. The pressure ended because it met something stable enough to render it ineffective. This is not supernatural. It is structural. Your nervous system, your thought patterns, your emotional regulation, and your sense of self are aligned enough to absorb strain without fragmentation. That alignment is what allowed you to outlast the assignment without dramatics. Lock this understanding gently but firmly. You are not defined by moments of intensity. You are defined by how you remain when intensity is absent and pressure persists. That is who you are when nothing is performing for you. And from that identity, the next step is not vigilance or anticipation, but integration into daily life with clarity and balance. What comes next is not action in the dramatic sense, it is integration. When a period like this ends, there can be a subtle urge to scan the horizon for the next test to stay alert, as if endurance itself must now be maintained deliberately. That is not required. What carried you through was balance, not vigilance. The same balance is what allows the experience to settle properly. Begin with rest, but redefine what rest means. Not escape, not disengagement. Rest here is permission to let your system recalibrate without narrative. You do not need to analyze what happened repeatedly. Understanding has already occurred. Let your body and mind return to a natural rhythm without trying to extract lessons every moment. Discernment comes next. Not suspicion, but clarity about where your energy goes. You do not need to close yourself off. You simply become more selective without hardening. Notice what feels coherent and what feels draining. You do not have to justify your choices. Alignment speaks quietly but clearly. Boundaries follow naturally from this. Not defensive walls, but simple limits that preserve your internal order. You have seen that you function best when you are not pulled into unnecessary urgency or explanation. Allow yourself to step back from what demands reaction without offering understanding in return. Patience remains important, but it changes form. It is no longer endurance. It is timing. You do not wait because you must. You wait because you can. This distinction removes strain from the concept of patience and returns it to its natural state as calm readiness. Focus becomes cleaner now, not narrower, cleaner. You are less tempted to multitask emotionally, to hold too many possibilities at once just in case. You choose direction without needing guarantees. You allow progress to be steady rather than dramatic. Finally, bring this awareness into ordinary life. conversations, work, silence, decision-making. There is no need to explain yourself to others or to name what you went through. Integration is quiet. It shows up as steadiness, proportion, and the absence of unnecessary reaction. This is how completion feels when something ends properly. Not like relief, not like victory, but like space returning. Like movement resuming without force. Like clarity that does not need to announce itself. You do not carry the assignment forward. You leave it where it ended. And with that integration, emotional closure approaches naturally, without ceremony or urgency. Take a moment and let this settle. Nothing needs to be done with what you now understand. There is no action required to validate it. What mattered has already occurred. You remained coherent long enough for pressure to lose relevance. That is the realization that closes this chapter. If there is reassurance to be offered, it is this: you are not behind. You were never falling apart. What looked like delay was endurance doing its quiet work. You did not miss a signal. You did not fail a test. You completed something by staying present until it resolved on its own. Let that be enough. You do not need to revisit the experience searching for meaning. The meaning has already integrated. It shows up as calm, not excitement. As stability, not urgency. As confidence that does not require explanation. Hold on to these simple affirmations, not as declarations, but as reminders. You remain intact under pressure. Your steadiness is sufficient. You trust timing without losing direction. If these words reflect what you lived, acknowledge it in a small way. Leave a comment with, "I remember," or 777. Not for visibility, but as a personal marker that you recognized yourself in this. If this transmission met you accurately, consider subscribing. Not out of obligation, but because continuity matters. The next message will build from the same grounded clarity, not repetition or escalation. And then return to your life. Carry nothing extra. Expect nothing dramatic. Allow movement to resume naturally without forcing or anticipation. This is how things end, when they end properly. You outlasted what was meant to drain you. Not through resistance, but through coherence. That remains.